The chat's now, it's closed the chat, which is chat. Someone say something, it's cancel the chat. There you go. Okay. Never mind, I'll figure it out. So to finally finish off the material of the course, we're going to finish up by talking about whole versus part practice. And what that means is when we are teaching a motor skill, or if we're learning a motor skill, is it best to learn the action in full, or is it better to break things in parts and then learn them individually? Any ideas? Yep, it'll definitely depend on the skill. Yeah, Yasmin, what you said in parts, what did you do for your assignment? Dribbling and soccer. Okay. Did you practice it in parts? Because the general rule is that it depends on the complexity of the skill. So if skills are super complex, oh, you did both, okay. And which is probably going to be true of a lot of the different skills that you chose for your assignments. But the general rule is that you have to base the decision based on the complexity of the skill and whether or not the parts are independent. And so that's what we're going to first talk about. So we have learned previously that to memorize things, organizing things into sections is the best for sort of retaining information based on our short-term memory limits. So you're chunking it, and then it allows for it to be better processed and put into long-term memory. That's a little bit different than what we're talking about in terms of complexity and organization, but it does relate to this idea that if something is very, very complicated with multiple number of parts, that it may be too much for us to take in one setting. And so you it would be better to learn the motor skill in sections. And so first, we have to come up with two definitions. And studies looked at doing or learning a skill in full versus learning a skill in parts. Whole practice is the term that they utilize to suggest learning the skill as a whole. So if you're learning a dance routine, then you're going to learn it from start to finish, all the different moves from start to finish, and then practice that over and over and over again. Part practice is when you divide the motor skill into individual sections, and then you practice the individual sections separately. And so an example of that with our dance routine would be learning a dance routine in sections, practicing them individually, and then putting them all together. Our decision to choose one or the other is going to be based on the complexity and organization of the skill. And so for the dancers in the class, what do you typically do? I think I've asked this before, but what do you typically do to break or to teach a dance routine? Classy said that she usually breaks it up into individual parts. I guess you could argue that it's going to be based on the complexity and the organization of the dance routine. So if you're going to break it up into parts, you got to choose parts where it's not like mid-action of something, right? You can't separate things that are highly organized, meaning that if the motor skill has a high level of organization, it means that everything's interconnected. Complexity is more based on the difficulty. Depends on the experience of the dancers. Yeah. Ooh, count to 8. Interesting that you put it into counts of 8 because we learn 7 plus or minus 2. That's our limits of short-term memory. 7 plus or minus 2 items. Interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't connected that either. We just lived it. Good thing we're recording this. So, two sort of terms or sort of two things to consider when breaking up or when either teaching a motor skill in whole or breaking it up into parts is going to be based, like I said, on the complexity and organization of a skill. The complexity is a way to describe or relates to the number of the parts or components of the skill and how difficult or how much processing is required. So very difficult things are going to have high levels of complexity. Like very intricate, fine motor skill type stuff is going to have a high degree of complexity because it's going to require more attention. Make sense? Organization is how the individual parts are interconnected. Like think about a basketball jump shot. To teach a basketball jump shot, would you practice jumping, shoulder flexion, throwing a ball? Or would you kind of sort of put it all together or break it up into shooting and then a jumping? Oh, is it working? Yeah, you definitely put it together in this case because it's hard to like sort of break it apart or everything's sort of interdependent on each other. And that's what's meant by organization. That if the components of the skill are interdependent, meaning they are sort of like happening in unison and working together, you would say it has a high level of organization, meaning it's too difficult to break it up. Things that have a low level of organization would be serial motor skills. Remember that term where we were talking about the one-dimensional classification of motor skills, and then you had fine versus discrete skills? And then serial skills was a term they used to create like a series of discrete tasks. Sorry, it was not fine versus gross. It was a continuous versus discrete. So fractionization is a term to describe one hand versus the other. So that's a way to sort of break it up. But they were talking about like breaking up the actual movements into components. So if you're learning a jump shot with the opposite arm, you're still going through the same motion. So if you have high levels of complexity of a skill, it's probably better to break it up into parts. If you have a high level of organization of aspects of a skill, it's good to keep those together. And so basing your decision is going to be on the interplay between complexity and organization. You could probably definitely think about it, and every skill is going to have its own little nuances and individual specifics that are going to be high or low in either complexity and organization. But hopefully with doing the assignment and sort of analyzing a skill that you're familiar with or learning about, that you had to go through this sort of like cognitive process in sort of how to break up. Okay, so I should break it up here. I should break it up there. This part is very complex. This part isn't. It's for sure something that you all thought about as you were completing the assignment, or you're about to finish it after we're done this lecture. So now let's talk about if you've decided that you want to practice a skill in parts, how are you going to break it up? Romeo talked about fractionization. I have a video if you guys want to see it. Do you want to see the video? This is an example. How am I going to do this? Present a screen. Stop presenting. Present a screen. Do you all hear the fire alarm going on? Or it's a car alarm? Okay, watch this video. Can you all see it? Yeah? Everyone can see it? Can everyone see the video? Okay, good. So this video is sort of talking about learning to come off the uneven bars in gymnastics and the way that the coaches have separated the skill into parts. Ah, did it. Any gymnasts in the class? Anyone that's gone through those like series of progressions? No? Everyone's still there? Yep. So you saw in that video, which was sort of interesting, about the progression of breaking up the spin on the uneven bars into little parts. And so that method is one example of taking a complex skill that would be more difficult to learn as a whole and the best sort of like way to break it up based on experience, the education level of the learners, the materials and equipment available. Everything sort of factors in together, right? The timing of the practices. Romeo had talked about fractionization as a way of practicing parts of a skill. Fractionization is a way to describe breaking up a skill that requires the use of both hands in an asymmetric way, so an asymmetrical bimanual task. And so you practice what you would do with each hand individually. So the most common example would be playing the piano or playing the guitar. You practice strumming with one side, and then you practice fretting with the fingers, and then you sort of put it all together. Has anyone played a two-handed instrument before? Or does play? I'm sure there's a piano and guitar player in the class. Alto sax, well. But how, if you remembered learning, how did they break up the two different hands? Did you practice one hand first and then the other hand, or? That brings me to one study. When they're talking about musical skills, so I remember when I learned playing guitar, you did practice fretting a little bit and strumming, and then you sort of put it together. But when you learn musical instruments, they do this thing called part whole, meaning that they do both hands at, you start learning with both hands at once, but the one hand is doing a less difficult version of what they would do ultimately in the real task. So you're sort of developing the timing of both hands at once while practicing the fine dexterity of the one side. So with Romeo, would you say that that is something that they did? So another term or another way to break up complex skill into parts is called segmentation. It's also called the progressive part strategy. And it's called the progressive part strategy because you are breaking up the skill into parts and then progressing by doing part one, two, one, two, three. And so you're sequentially just adding more and more parts until you get to the end. And I think that would be something more typical of like dance routines, right, Swasi? So that's called segmentation or the progressive part strategy, which I feel is a very common way that we have had experience learning a complex skill over time. The third way is called simplification, and this is a way of practicing an easier version of the skill before practicing the real skill. And there's a multitude of number of ways to simplify a task, and it's going to be dependent on the task itself. And so here is an example of a whole bunch of different versions and how it relates to a whole bunch of different ways that we have practiced skills by learning a simpler method first. One example would be learning how to ride a bike with training wheels. With training wheels, you can't fall over, so you're practicing the pedaling and steering while you later develop the balance. Another way is reducing an object's difficulty. So you learn to juggle. Has anyone learned to juggle? I have not. So did you learn with scarves or something smaller or lighter at first? I remember when we were in primary school and we were learning beanbags. Oh, there you go. I remember the volleyball one. That's why I put it down. I remember we learned volleyball. Remember we were learned off of the big yellow ball first. It was softer, so you could practice like the skill, the bumping and serving, hitting it before using the real volleyball. Can anyone think of any other examples of reducing an object's difficulty as a way to sort of like simplify a motor skill for learning? I'm trying to think. Yeah, that's a good one. Stassi is saying practicing platform dives before a diving board. So it's like a solid surface versus one that would give. You can reduce the attention demands of the skill. So this is what's typically a way to, or used as a way to describe assistive devices. So I talked about the training wheels ones. What about like gait assistance devices, right? When you're like relearning how to walk, you start off with a walker, and then progress to a bar, and then by yourself. Hannah was saying when there's a spinning object starting with no rotation. Oh, okay, yeah. That's way to simplify it. So that's kind of a way of describing like reducing movement speed. So probably in dance, you learn something slower, and then as you learn the motor skill, you can go faster. Object difficulty, another one would be like a or reducing attention spans would be like T-ball, where you learn off of the tee versus someone pitching when you're learning baseball. You could add auditory cues to sort of like indicate the sort of rhythm or like the parts of the motor skill that are like needing to be completed in series. Generally speaking, you could add progressive sequences that are more and more difficult based on Gentile's taxonomy. So think of what we just watched. That is the progressive part method, and that's doing like individually things that are progressing to the ultimate skill. And then the last one that is probably where all the research is going now is simulators and virtual reality environments. Think about like like in the hospital, all the different mannequins now for training nurses, firefighting, airplane simulators. So many things are done now, like practice virtually before you start off surgery. Can we think of any other examples? Oh, racing, sure. But now with the level of technology, simulators and like VR is so much more advanced that you can really optimize it to help with the training. And if that's especially important for like things where the learners are put at risk of serious harm, right? Or if like you're like for hospitals, like you're not putting the patients at risk. Here's an example of an assistive device in a hospital, relearning how to walk. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing about sort of like breaking up a skill is it can be very difficult at times. This study was using a computer game, and what they were saying was that using this idea of momentary intentions, that if it's hard to break up the whole skill, you can have the person focus on an aspect of the skill that you are trying to have them learn the most. So this was I think this was like it was a computer game where they had to pilot a ship and shoot enemies and then drop mines. And so what they did was they showed that you couldn't break up the computer game, but you could have the learners focus on a specific aspect. So mind handling, ship control, and mind handling. And whatever you told them to really focus on, that part would increase or would be learned faster than the other parts. So you could also have or verbalize and teach the students to focus on a particular aspect. And that's something we all probably can relate to in different avenues, school, sports, rehab, everything. Where you would tell the students to focus in on something and they will tend to focus in on that as they're performing the motor skill. Make sense? Perfect. Now, the last aspect of the skill, I talked about it, or the last aspect of the skill, the last topic of the course is mental practice and imagery. And we talked about it at the end of last day really briefly. And this idea of mental practice is because it's something that we all do. We all sort of imagine ourselves doing something. We imagine aspects of the skill. We can imagine ourselves doing well. We can imagine ourselves doing poorly. It can allow us to overthink. But mental practice in itself has an impact and can be effective for learning or relearning motor skills. So imagery or mental practice has its place in this idea of learning motor skills or optimizing the learning of motor skills. How many of you sort of imagine or practice mentally for different things in your life? And what would be an example? Any athletes still on the group chat? Okay, so before a presentation for sure. And sort of what do you imagine? Okay. So you are imagining cognitive or procedural aspects of a motor skill or of the skill itself. Yeah. And so what do you imagine, Hannah? Cool. So we've all done it. And typically when you are imagining or like practicing mentally, you're imagining specific aspects of the skill or different parts of it, different movements. Or you are imagining yourself or something or the actual skill. Fascinating. Does marking count as members in a dance routine? So you imagine yourself doing it, and then you're giving yourself a grade on what you're imagining? Because that's brown parents for you. You're critiquing your own marking routine on the spot. I'm not sure what you mean. Like, oh, okay, wait. So you're okay, no. So you're marking, but by marking, do you mean giving yourself a mark? Okay, that's why. Marking routine on the spot. I'm not sure what that means. I feel dumb. Like doing your marking. Why is that called marking? Oh, you're kind of like going through the like, yeah, that's exactly like so you're yeah. So you're like walking, okay, you would do a thing there, and then you like jump around, and then yeah. Yeah, that it would be mental practice with a bit of like physical components to it, but yeah. So we Hannah for the win. And so what research has looked at is now that we can all agree that we've all done mental practice or imagery in some way and for different reasons, research wanted to look at, does mental practice aid in the acquisition of motor skill learning? And is it a means of like sort of preparation for a well-learned motor skill? This study was looking at relearning, remember the rehabilitation pegboard tool? Having controlled learned that. And so what they did was they broke up the amount of practice that each of the different groups would do into a percentage of physical practice and mental practice. Now, obviously, in looking at the breakdown, you could see that the all physical practice group scored the highest on a retention test. But we can see that the only mental practice group did better than a control group that had no practice at all. So ultimately speaking, the results of the study sort of confirm that mental practice is better than no practice at all. And if you're not stressing people out, then doing any mental practice is better than nothing at all. And so what this is applies to as one avenue that it could be really important is in medical situations where, think about like post-surgery or when someone's injured, it can be difficult for having them relearn how to walk immediately as soon as surgery was done or after a grafting complication or whatever. So mental practice has advantages in a medical setting because it can be started like immediately on in the recovery process because there's no risks. It's obviously inexpensive. You would still have to like sort of maybe have some graphs or have some pictures or tell the workers on what to tell the patients. So there's some training, so it's not completely cheap, completely free, but it's no equipment, so it's inexpensive. It can be done anywhere, even in the bed, the hospital bed, and there's no safety risk, which is the ultimate concern. And so different research studies have shown how that can be applied into speeding up learning. Now, with athletes, let me see if this will work here. So here's a video of an athlete practicing mentally. That's an example of an athlete using mental practice or imagining. And so one thing that researchers has sort of evaluated in like talking to people and different athletes and different learners and about what they're thinking about as they are imagining is that it can be motivational. So they could use it to sort of like imagine themselves doing well and it can hype them up to get them ready for or prepare them for performing the motor skill. It could also be cognitive in that they are like sort of like mentally rehearsing and learning the cognitive components of the skill that they're practicing. And then the next round of research wanted to look at like maybe there is sort of a way to describe someone's mental ability and then you could teach them, right? Why is mental practice effective? And so why do you think that mental practice assists with the acquisition of learning skills? There's different ideas and they're probably all right. There was a neuromuscular hypothesis where they would have people imagine, they hooked up electrodes to individuals and then had them imagine performing a motor skill. and then they read some mild EMG recording in the muscles, even though it wasn't enough for contraction. Maybe it was like priming the coordination patterns of the motor skill. There's the brain activity hypothesis, so maybe it's doing similarly, but sort of like rehearsing the neurological connections and pathways that are utilized in performing of a motor skill sort of at the cerebral level. And then the cognitive hypothesis, and remember we were talking about the course always about increasing the ability to learn is about keeping mentally or cognitively attended to the skill that you're learning. And so maybe by doing mental practice, you are practicing the cognitive and aspects, or you're sort of cognitively processing the motor skill, much like you would do when you're performing the motor skill. And so the last point is that remember how with standardized testing, research has always gone to a way of like being able to sort of like test someone and categorize them. The last little bit of imagery has been trying to figure out if you could break up someone into a particular like imagery ability or how to divide that up. And that way you could see where someone's level is at a imagery. And then if you have athletes or learners that aren't very good at imagery, maybe you could like teach them to be better so they could exploit and take advantage of, you know, the small improvements or the improvements that imagery ability has provided in research. And that is the course. Any questions? No, thank you. Okay.